Excellencies, Your Excellencies and gentlemen, I think the setting for this discussion has become much easier than it might have done because of the very clear message that has been given about the importance that the British government, in fact the three parliamentary parties, give to Gulf security, that the Gulf fundamentally remains in the United Kingdom's strategic interests, and that the military capability to support that policy is very much behind one of the issues that the issue they're looking at within the Strategic Defence Review. Normally, this presentation would have followed a presentation on the threat. For reasons of availability of speakers, etc., we're actually having to prejudge the threat. And I just might make a statement. When the Cold War came down, when the war came down in Germany, and I was then the Commander-in-Chief, and the person sitting on my right was the Corps Commander. And we were trying to find out really what the intelligence community thought the threat was. And we blew for the Brigadier, who was in charge of the British Defence, British military intelligence. And I said, "What is the threat, David?" He said, "General, it's multi-directional and multifaceted," which means I haven't a clue where it's coming from. In all of this discussion, though, that we've had this morning, I've had a clear sense that military action is felt or could be required at some stage in the future in the Gulf. And if that is a reality, then I think it's important that we understand what the realities of military action are, and clearly that must be something that clearly concerns military plans. We also need to be clear about what the options are for the use of that military force. And what do we have to do in peacetime as allies to make sure we're as prepared as we should be, both militarily and of course politically, to prepare ourselves for the unexpected. Because I think it's that will be so important. And if I could just comment briefly on the Strategic Defence Review and say on a personal basis how delighted I am that the increased emphasis that has clearly been given in that review to take forward the work that was done on the Joint Rapid Deployment Force, and with all that means in terms of the projection of power, of the means in terms of command and control, of operational logistic support over much longer lines of communication where we perhaps don't have the same amount of host nation support that we expected during the time of the Cold War, and all it means for strategic and tactical mobility. And again, what that means in peacetime. I would also just add that I think the United Kingdom, because of its history, has an understanding of expeditionary warfare or power projection that other nations don't have. And we were able during the Falkland Islands and during the Gulf War, despite that not being the top of our defence priorities, actually to bring that capability together. What we need to do is to see how we can improve it. And in parallel with all of this, of course, is what the Americans talk about, the revolution in military affairs. You have the zealots on one hand, and I'm not sure, I'll introduce my team in a minute, I'm not sure whether I have a zealot on my left or not, but they almost, the zealots would argue, that with the new capabilities in terms of the precision of weapons, the lethality of weapons, the availability of intelligence and information so much more rapidly, and the speed with which you can deliver that firepower means almost that the fog of war will cease to exist. And then there are the pragmatists, of which I think I include myself, who recognise that yes, this is a dramatic increase in capability, but I think we perhaps play down how dramatic that is. Now, to really lead us into the discussion are two key players. On my right, known to many of you, General Sir Charles Guthrie, who is the Chief of the Defence Staff, and on my left, Professor Lawrence Freedman, Head of the Department of War Studies at King's College. And I don't think we could have two better people to talk about future warfare and what the implications are for Gulf defence.
Thank you very much. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. The two previous British speakers came from Glasgow. I don't come from Glasgow. I don't come from Scotland. I'm not Scottish, and therefore I don't belong to a tribe which is currently dominant in public life in this country. However, I hope what I say you will think still is worthwhile. I'm, of course, delighted to have the opportunity to address this important conference on the subject of future warfare and the implications for defence in the Gulf region. I think that we move towards globalization. By that I mean the increase in the links, economic, cultural, communications and military, which bind countries together, means that changes in future warfare will affect us all in similar ways, and not separately in the Gulf region. In this context, I had hoped that I might be able to say a bit more about the outcome of our Strategic Defence Review as we're thinking behind our plans for the future United Kingdom Armed Forces is relevant, very relevant to the subject of this session. But I really can't add very much more to what we already have from Dr. Reid. Nevertheless, much of what I shall say is conditioned by the extensive debates which have taken place during our review over the last 10 months. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to cover in outline what I consider are 5 key areas for the future. The wide spectrum of potential conflicts, the importance of a joint environment, the need to have forces with deployability, and this includes logistic support, the importance of interoperability with allies, and finally, the benefits and limitations of new technology. Now that's a broad canvas, and I cannot cover every aspect of these areas in the time available, but I hope I can raise some points to stimulate debate. First, the spectrum of conflict. The world is in many respects more complex and unpredictable than 10 years ago. The fragmentation which has followed the end of the Cold War has refocused us on localized conventional war, and the spectrum of types of conflict which may occur is broad. One end of the scale is a major war, such as the one which happened in the Gulf in 1990 to 91. The other is the small terrorist action. Of course, the Gulf was high intensity in terms of hardware and force levels, whilst nevertheless being brought to a conclusion relatively quickly and with few casualties on our side. This may not be a model for the future. There's also a trend towards multinational peacekeeping operations, to which a community of responsible nations will wish to contribute. And there's now an emphasis on what we call defense diplomacy, training teams and other activities which reinforce stability. But military forces will continue to need to be trained to cover the full scale of conflict. And because high-intensity fighting is very demanding, considerable resources will continue to be required for this sort of training. Some reductions in field training, though, I think are now possible through better simulation and computer-assisted exercises. Simulation is particularly important for exercising commanders who otherwise are taken up with a myriad practicalities and problems of exercising troops. When I was a corps commander, I always felt I could put my divisional commanders under far greater stress with the use of a computer than a field exercise. I couldn't create the friction of war on a field exercise, but I could create friction with the civil population, the police, and the environmentalists very easily. But that was not the friction of war. But whatever the intensity of conflict, a trend which is worrying is that the probability of the use of chemical, or even worse, biological weapons is increasing. This, of course, lies at the heart of our continuing concerns with the Iraqi regime. Unfortunately, the technology of biological warfare is relatively simple for trained scientists, and at low cost, but not at low risk. A country or organisation can produce a credible weapon. An asymmetric conflict, by which I mean conflicts where one participant is much more powerful than conventional military means, this could redress the balance of power. However, the means of effective delivery are rather harder to develop than the weapons themselves, and this increases the likelihood that chemical or biological attacks would be unconventional, that is, delivered by special forces or terrorism, rather than by missile, aircraft, or projectile. There doesn't seem much point to me, for example, in enormous expenditure on ballistic missile defense, if the most likely means of delivery is in a suitcase in the back of a truck. All this points to the need to have sound intelligence on chemical and biological weapons, and for military forces and the civil population to have appropriate detection and force protection equipment. My next point was jointness. It's clear to me that nearly all campaigns in the future will involve all the environments, sea, air and land. They'll be joint. And I think the Gulf region could hardly exemplify this point more perfectly in view of its geography. I firmly believe that each arm of the services needs to retain its own identity and its own ethos, but each must form part of an integrated whole on operations. This carries implications for the organisation and training of defence forces. Single service leadership and organisation is still fundamental, but defence organisations need a strong central control of resources to ensure that the balance between environments and that joint projects are appropriately funded. We feel operations also need to be centrally directed. Our own permanent joint headquarters, which is separate from the Ministry of Defence headquarters, may not be an exact model for other nations, but it's got us, the British, off to an excellent start. And I firmly believe that the joint aspect does point the way ahead. Where more than one service provides identical or very similar functions, rationalisation is required to avoid the waste of resources. In addition, training is required which builds at each level, from single service competencies through to joint exercises involving frontline units and headquarters staff. My next point, deployability and logistics. The major change where the main alliance we belong to, NATO, has been removed from a static environment in Europe to a far more fluid and flexible environment where the one certainty is that we shall have to move to the area of the conflict. This is relatively simple for naval forces, provided they have resupply ships or host nation ports are available. But it's far, far harder for both air and land forces, which carry a considerable tail of support. The lessons we have learned recently have been in deployability and sustainability. The first, deployability, is perhaps on the face of it less relevant to Gulf states. But of course, the distances within your region are vast, and long-range movement of forces in any conflict would probably be necessary. Aircraft cannot provide the amount of lift required except for early entry or light forces, and so the majority will have to move on land or sea. All countries will have to consider their new requirements. For the United Kingdom, we will certainly have to invest more in strategic lift, balancing investment between air and sea elements. We also have to ensure that when deployed, we can communicate effectively, and the demand for strategic communications, voice and data traffic, and probably video conferencing increases each year. Secondly, forces must be sustainable. When they have deployed, and this means providing flexible transport and distribution networks. This is resource and manpower intensive, and we have found that we must allocate more to this area and spend more from our budgets if our frontline forces are to be fully combat capable. I recognise that there are different levels of support depending on the availability of host nation facilities. In the Gulf, we have been very fortunate that you, our friends and allies, have been generous in your help. But there are obviously limits to what the infrastructure in your region could accommodate in the event of major deployments. I recall how much of the preparation in 1990-91 was simply in building up forces and all of their supplies. My fourth point was interoperability. Most crises will in future require a multinational response. For the United Kingdom, NATO has been for many years and remains the cornerstone of our security policy. Therefore, we have moved towards interoperability with our European and North American allies over a long period. But we're now finding that where we operate with non-NATO partners, procedures and equipment standards of NATO have permeated other nations' forces and are immensely helpful for forming coalitions. I give you the example of Bosnia and the Gulf. This trend, I think, is likely to continue and even increase as NATO expands its membership. However, there is a potential technological barrier to interoperability with the rapid advance, particularly in the United States of America, of digital communication and information systems. I'm going to return to this in a minute. My next point, technology. Advances in technology will have a profound effect, not just in advanced weaponry, but also in new means of warfare, new pressures on decision-making, the necessity for new concepts and doctrine, and new command structures, and what is often now called information warfare. We need to harness technological change to increase our efficiency. However, before I cover the ways in which technological advances will change warfare, I wish to mention the limitations of technology. New technology is not necessarily the dominant factor in a conflict. It is not a substitute for political wisdom. In high-intensity conflict, information is no use without the means to concentrate force at the right time and in the right place, or to be able to operate from secure bases, or to achieve surprise. Low-intensity conflict, the context may not lend itself to high technology weapons. For example, in the fight against terrorism or insurgents. Increasing complexity means a potential increase in individual technical education and training, and in collective training. Without investment in training, there's a risk of not being able fully to exploit the advantage of this new and very expensive technology. Turning now to the benefits of new technology, one of the striking aspects has been the change in the lead from military to civil technology. The military has traditionally been the spearhead of progress, but was now a civil lead in many areas, and especially in computing and communication. There's also change in civil procurement and support methods, which will keep costs down and get equipment into service quicker. A rapid pace of change requires a quicker procurement cycle, but civil standards and methods are not always appropriate. Off the shelf may not be enough to win. Sometimes the best technology, rather than merely good, is required. For example, just in time is not sound military logistics in war.
Moreover,